While we were gone, we did pay attention to some television. One of the strangest things that I saw, and Kathy too, that we saw, was this White House press briefing that had Stephen Miller, the Nazi too young to buy beer. Stephen Miller conducted the press briefing. I don't know what that was all about. But Jim Acosta just about stripped the bark off this little bastard, to tell you the truth. Uh, Miller was totally unprepared for Jim Acosta, who was CNN, totally unprepared for his direct questions. And he was not capable of changing the subject like these rat bastards do. Acosta kept coming back at him with follow-up upon follow-up. And it's been described as journalism at its best, what Acosta did. So many of these reporters will allow bullshit answers to just slide. You've seen this as many times as I have. And you're sitting there watching this from your home or your office or whatever. And if you're like me, you're just screaming at the press person, don't let them get away with that shit. Pin them down. And of course they don't. And I guess maybe they're afraid that their press credentials will be taken from them if they don't play the game. Well, Acosta doesn't play the game. And if his press credentials were to be rescinded at this point, there would be a hell of an outbreak. But here's an example. Thanks to Crooks and Liars, Acosta said, quote, what you're proposing, or the approximated proposal here, is it does not, as I understand it, it's in keeping with the American tradition when it comes to immigration. The Statue of Liberty says, well, it doesn't say anything about speaking English or being able to be a computer program. Are you trying to change what it means to be an immigrant coming into this country if you're telling them you have to speak English? Can't people learn how to speak English when they get here? Now, this was in response to this tweet that the psycho in the White House put out about changing immigration policy to people who already speak English or to people who have advanced degrees or technological occupations. And it's stunning. But anyway, this is what the little Nazi said, quote, well, first of all, right now it's a requirement that to be naturalized, you have to speak English. Well, yeah, you dumb shit, to be naturalized, to become a citizen, but not to get through the door. Anyway, so he went on. So the notion wouldn't be very unusual. Secondly, I don't want to get into the whole thing about history here, but the Statue of Liberty is a symbolic American liberty lighting the world. The poem that you're referring to was added later. It is not actually a part of the original Statue of Liberty. But more fundamentally, and Acosta interrupts, you're saying that that does not represent what this country has always been thought of as immigration coming in this country? Miller answered, I'm saying that sounds like some national park revisionism. Listen to this little bastard. The statue of Acosta. They're not always going to speak English, Stephen. They're not always going to be highly skilled. Miller. Jim, I appreciate your speech. So let's talk about this. Now, the little Nazi was not happy to be confronted with the whole bring your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest-tossed to me. I lift up my lamp beside the golden door. So there's some back and forth, and then Miller tried to throw out lots of numbers, random immigration numbers, blah, blah, you know. Miller said this, Jim, you don't think that a wall affects green card policy. You couldn't possibly believe that, do you? Actually, the notion that you actually think that immigration is at a historic low, with the new chief of staff on Monday talking about how border crossings were, I want to be serious, Jim. Do you really at CNN not know the difference between green card policy and illegal immigration? I mean, you really don't know that? Acosta. My father was an immigrant. He came to this country right before the Cuban Missile Crisis and obtained a green card. Yes, people who immigrate to this country, not through Ellis Island, in other words, do obtain a green card at some point. They do it through a lot of hard work. And yes, they may learn English as a second language later on in this life. But this whole notion of, well, they have to learn English before they get to the United States, are we just going to bring in people from Great Britain and Australia? And then the little Nazi said this, "Oh, I can honestly say I'm shocked at your statement that you think the only people from Great Britain and Australia would know English. It's actually, well, it reveals your cosmopolitan bias to a shocking degree." Your cosmopolitan bias. This is an amazing moment. This is an amazing moment that you think only people from Great Britain and Australia who speak English is so insulting to millions of hardworking immigrants who do speak English from all over the world. Jim, have you honestly never met an immigrant from another country who speaks English outside of Great Britain and Australia? Is that your personal experience? Acosta. Sounds like you're trying to engineer the racial and ethnic flow of people into this country. Miller. Jim, that is one of the most outrageous, insulting, ignorant, and foolish things you've ever said. And for you, that's the notion that you think that this is a racist bill is so wrong and so insulting. Now, let me share something with you. Stephen Miller is a Jew. Which really doesn't matter until you consider that the core supporters of Trump are anti-Semitic, they're racist, they're anti-immigrant. But Stephen Miller is what you would call Judenrat. Judenrat. It's a German word, and what it means literally is Jewish council in German. Judenrat. So I looked this up, and let me share with you. As far back as 1933, Nazi policymakers had discussed establishing Jewish-led institutions to carry out anti-Jewish policies. The concept was based upon centuries-old practices which were instituted in Germany during the Middle Ages. As the German army swept through Poland and the Soviet Union, it carried out an order of SS leader Heydrich to require the local Jewish populace to form Jewish councils, Judenrat, as a liaison between the Jews and the Nazis. These councils of Jewish elders were responsible for organizing the orderly deportation to the death camps, for detailing the number and occupations of the Jews in the ghettos, for distributing food and medical supplies such as they were, and for communicating the orders of the ghetto Nazi masters. The Nazis enforced these orders on the Judenrat with threats of terror, which were given credence by beatings and executions on the spot. As ghetto life settled into a so-called routine, the Judenrat took on the functions of local government, providing, as they could, police and fire protection, postal services, sanitation, transportation, food, and housing. Now, needless to say, Jewish leaders were ambivalent about participating in these organizations, these Judenrat. On the other hand, a lot of the Jews saw these councils as collaboration with the Nazis, which is how I see them. I mean, I can't help myself. Others saw these councils as a necessary evil, which would permit Jewish leadership to form a forum to negotiate for better treatment. Well, there was no better treatment in Hitler's plan to exterminate the Jews. There was no such thing. Hannah Arendt stated in her 1963 book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is about the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was considered to be the architect of the Holocaust, or as the Germans put it, the Nazis put it, not the Germans, the final solution. Anyway, Hannah Arendt said that without the assistance of the Judenrat, the registration of the Jews, their concentration in ghettos, and later their active assistance in the other Jews' deportation to extermination camps, fewer Jews would have perished because the Germans would have encountered considerable difficulties in drawing up lists of Jews. And in occupied Europe, the Nazi leaders depended upon the Jewish officials that they would make such lists of Jews, along with information about the property they owned. The Judenrat also directed the Jewish police to assist the Germans in catching Jews and loading them onto transport trains leaving for Nazi death camps. In her book, I have a point here, I'll get to it in a second. In her book, Hannah Arendt wrote that, quote, to a Jew, this role of the Jewish leaders in the destruction of their own people is undoubtedly the darkest chapter of the whole dark story. In the matter of cooperation, she goes on, there was no distinction between the highly assimilated Jewish communities of Central and Western Europe and the Yiddish-speaking masses of the East. In Amsterdam as in Warsaw, in Berlin as in Budapest, Jewish officials could be trusted to compile the lists of persons and their properties. Stephen Miller reminds me of a Judenrat. He's the type of Jew who would send his own people into the furnaces. You can tell that by looking at him, by listening to this little Nazi, by listening to the words that he uses, to listening to the contempt that drips from his voice, the smug, sarcastic attitude as if to say, I may be a Jew, but I am part of the Judenrat. I am safe. He's part of the Trump organization, which supposedly makes him safe from the anti-Semites, the right-wing paramilitary organizations who back Trump, who are, by definition, anti-Semitic.